So, what happens when a war is over, but the ghosts just won't leave? That's what we're digging into today. We're looking at a huge, landmark trial that basically forced an entire nation to face its darkest memories. This is the story of Thomas Kwoyelo, an LRA commander, and it's all about accountability, memory, and just how high the price of justice can be.
All right, let's just dive right in with a quote from the court itself. I mean, this one sentence, it just perfectly captures the absolute horror of the conflict that tore through northern Uganda. And really, this idea is the foundation for one of the most important war crimes trials that country has ever seen.
Okay, so before we can even step foot in the courtroom, we've got to understand what was happening on the ground. You have to realize this wasn't our typical war, not at all. This was a calculated, systematic campaign of terror. In the Lord's Resistance Army, they were waging it against their own people. This conflict dragged on for over 20 years. It started out with these spiritual movements back in the 80s, but morphed into something much, much darker under Joseph Kony. And then 1994, that was a major turning point. The LRA moved into southern Sudan, and the violence just exploded. So by the time they even started talking about peace in 2006, the damage was, well, it was already immense. You know, the LRA's entire playbook was built on one thing: pure terror. This was never really about winning battles in the traditional sense. It was all about controlling people through fear. And how did they do it? By doing the unthinkable. They abducted children to fill their ranks, and they went after the most vulnerable people imaginable, even attacking the very camps that were supposed to be safe havens.
And right in the middle of all of this chaos, you have this one commander, Thomas Kwoyelo. When he was finally captured in 2009, it kicked off this massive legal firestorm. I mean, it was a case that would truly test the very foundations of Uganda's entire justice system. So Kwoyelo's capture, this wasn't some clean, simple arrest. No, this happened on the battlefield during a military operation. And that little detail, it would become a huge legal problem down the road. But the bottom line was, for the very first time, Uganda had a high-ranking LRA commander in custody. And now they had to ask themselves, what does justice, right here at home, actually look like?
And the charges against him? Absolutely staggering. We're talking more than 50 counts. This wasn't about just one bad act. The prosecution was arguing that this was a whole career built on atrocities, a pattern of violence that he not only committed himself, but ordered others to carry out too.
And that right there is why this trial was such a game changer. Usually a case this big would get shipped off to an international court, like the ICC in The Hague. But not this time. Uganda was absolutely determined to handle this one themselves. The big question, though, was, could their own courts actually handle a case this massive? Could the system bear that kind of weight?
But here's the thing. Before a single witness could even take the stand, the trial itself was basically put on trial. The defense came out swinging with a bunch of major legal challenges, and any one of them could have stopped the whole thing dead in its tracks. Okay, so roadblock number one was this whole issue of amnesty. See, Uganda had an Amnesty Act, and the whole point was to get rebels to give up. So, of course, Kwoyelo applied for it, and this created a huge dilemma. I mean, seriously, could a guy accused of the worst possible war crimes just get a pardon? Well, Uganda's Supreme Court came back with a very clear, very decisive answer. They said, look, the Amnesty Act can apply to the basic crime of rebellion, but no way does it give you a free pass for the most serious crimes known to humanity. It was a landmark ruling, and it meant the trial could finally move forward on those major charges. All right, next up, the defense challenged the fact that he was even in the courtroom at all. Remember, he was captured in the DRC, not formally extradited, so his lawyers argued, hey, this was an illegal abduction. But the court pulled out this really powerful legal idea that basically says, wrongly captured but rightly detained. The logic being that the crimes he was accused of were so incredibly serious that they outweighed any mistakes in how he was captured. And then came the final and really fascinating legal hurdle. The defense argued that since crimes against humanity weren't actually written down in Ugandan law at the time the crimes happened, he couldn't be tried for them. It's a clever argument, right? But the court said no. They upheld this core principle that some rules, these unwritten universal laws against things like mass murder and torture, are just so fundamental that any court anywhere in the world can enforce them. That was a huge moment for universal justice. So, with all of those massive legal battles out of the way, the trial could finally
get to the evidence. And this is when the court started to hear the most gut-wrenching, personal stories from the people who survived these attacks. This is when the charges on paper became terrifyingly real. The prosecution really built its case around specific, awful incidents. Take, for example, an attack on a traditional ceremony for newborn twins. Can you imagine? And what's more, eyewitnesses, people from Kwoyelo's own community, got on the stand and testified that they saw him there, leading the fighters who turned a celebration into a bloodbath. It was those personal accounts that really formed the heart of this trial.
And this really shows you just how careful the court was being. This wasn't some kangaroo court just looking for a guilty verdict. For instance, they actually acquitted Kwoyelo of one murder charge because the evidence showed the victim was an armed military informant, not a protected civilian. But, on the other hand, for the attack on the Pagak camp for displaced people, he was convicted. Why? Because the eyewitness testimony was just overwhelming.
So, in the end, after carefully going through every single charge, the court found Thomas Kwoyelo guilty on dozens and dozens of counts. And the convictions, they covered this whole horrific spectrum of actions, from murder and pillaging to rape and torture. He was held responsible not just for what he did with his own hands, but for what he commanded others to do. So you have this legal battle that stretched on for more than a decade. And you might be wondering, why does this one case, this one conviction, matter so much? What's the real takeaway here? Not just for Uganda, but for the rest of us. Because this case was never just about one guy. It was a huge statement. First, it proved that a country like Uganda can handle these incredibly complex international trials right at home. It also reinforced the rule of law, saying that those unwritten universal rules really do have teeth. But maybe most importantly, it sent a powerful message to LRA commanders that the days of getting away with it were over. And for the survivors, it was finally a chance to have their stories heard, to have their suffering acknowledged in a formal, public way.
And that really leaves us with the big, lingering question, doesn't it? A guilty verdict, that's accountability. That's a huge, critical piece of the puzzle. But can one trial, just one, really heal the deep, deep wounds of an entire nation? For a community that's been shattered by decades of trauma, you have to think that justice in a courtroom, it's probably just the very first step on a much, much longer road.